A man saved a dog from drowning, but then he realized the truth. It all began with a frantic splash, so sudden and violent that it seemed to slice right through the evening's calm. Daniel stood on the riverbank, breath catching in his throat, heart thunderously pounding. Everything about that moment felt charged with electricity, as if fate had cast him in a role he'd never auditioned for. The sinking shape in the water was canine, fur matted and slick, front paws scrambling desperately, muzzle barely poking above the surface. There was a sickening reality to it. This dog was drowning, and Daniel was the only one around to do something about it. He didn't wait for logic. He leaped. The water slapped him with a cold so biting it momentarily stole the air from his lungs, but a single thought propelled him forward. Save the dog. His arms sliced through the churning current as he kicked hard, water frothed around him, the current tugging as if wanting to snatch him away. He fought it tooth and nail, refusing to let go of the single focus anchoring his fear. Finally, his hands found the pup's drenched fur. The animal's eyes bulged in terror, and it coughed out in panic squeals. For an instant, the dog clawed at Daniel's arms, as though too frightened to distinguish the rescuer from the threat. The pain seared, but Daniel only clenched his jaw. He wasn't letting go. He thrashed closer to the shore, muscles burning like molten iron. One stroke, two strokes, a foot brushing the sandy bottom. When at last he stood, water rushing around his waist, the dog slumped against his chest, trembling, breath rasping. Daniel stumbled back onto the riverbank, nearly collapsing with the exertion. Adrenaline pulsed like a drumbeat, making his vision blur. He coughed and spat out the brackish river water, chest on fire. The dog lay on the grass, panting, wet fur plastered to its ribs, eyes wide with a desperation that wrenched Daniel's heart. He knelt and pressed a hand to the dog's side, feeling the tremors quake through its small body. Something about that pitiful shiver broke him open. He'd never considered himself a dog person in any particularly fervent sense. He liked animals, sure, but his life had been too tangled with heartbreak and disappointment to ever bond wholeheartedly with another living creature. And yet, in that instant, stroking the fur of this trembling animal he had just rescued from certain death, he felt a surge of protectiveness that left him breathless. It was as though he had discovered a piece of himself he hadn't even realized was missing. The dog let out a shaky whimper that caught in Daniel's chest. He scooted closer, ignoring the cold wetness soaking his clothes. With careful tenderness, he ran his palms along the pup's ribs, feeling for injuries. The dog winced but didn't snap at him, just trembled. "Easy, buddy," Daniel murmured, voice rasping. "You're safe now." Eventually, the dog drew in a long, ragged breath, its panting slowing to a more regular rhythm. Daniel glanced around, half expecting someone to bolt from the trees shouting for their lost dog, but the bank was deserted. The last glow of sunset lay across the water, turning the rushing current a shimmering auburn, an eerie beauty that contrasted with how close they'd been to tragedy moments ago. No one showed up. And that's when the first question, like a needle to the brain, stung him. Who would let a dog wander near this river alone? Or worse, did someone throw it in? The dog was no large, bounding creature. It was smallish, maybe some mix of terrier or sheepdog, black and white fur that was wet to the bone. Could it have fallen from somewhere upstream, or had it been tossed like garbage? The thought shook him. He glanced at the steep riverbank. Nothing was disturbed except for the spot he had plowed through in his frantic rescue. The water had no sign of a boat or footprints. It was possible the dog had strayed too close and slipped. Yet an unshakable dread settled in Daniel's stomach. Something was off about all of this. He lifted the dog carefully. The trembling in the small body seemed to intensify. Water dripped off the pup's fur onto Daniel's soaked jeans. His mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. There was a veterinary clinic in town, but it was miles away, and the nearest road was a good half-mile beyond the ridge. He had no car parked nearby. He'd come here on foot, hoping a long walk by the water might clear his thoughts. He was running, always running, from an avalanche of regrets too heavy to name. A battered memory stirred. As a kid, Daniel had lived with a grandmother who taught him the basics of first aid for animals, because she was a devoted caretaker of stray dogs and cats. He remembered how to check if an animal was breathing well, if there was water in its lungs, what color the gums should be. Mechanically, he did a quick assessment. The dog's gums looked pale but not deathly so. It was breathing, albeit shakily. He decided to head for the dirt path that snaked through the woods toward the main road. His mind was blazing with possible next steps, but he took a breath, shoving panic down. He'd figure this out. Clutching the trembling dog clothes, Daniel forced his body upright and started off. His clothes clung to him, each step heavier than the last, shoes squelching in the mud. The evening air already felt shockingly cold now that the sun was nearly gone. A breeze gusted through the pines, chilling him to the bone. The dog nuzzled weakly into his chest, letting out a soft whine. "It's okay," Daniel whispered, forging ahead. "I won't let anything else happen to you." A half-hour slog got them to the rutted dirt road he used as a hiking trail. Night closed in around them, black sky dotted with faint starlight. Daniel's breath plumed in the cold air. The dog shivered under his jacket. It was small enough that he could zip it into his coat, leaving its head free. With some relief, he realized the pup was drifting off, maybe from exhaustion or shock, but the heartbeat against Daniel's chest was strong. He reached a battered pickup parked behind a screen of trees, the one place he'd stashed it earlier in the day. He was surprised by a slight pang of guilt. It was his father's old truck, something Daniel had inherited but almost never used. Letting it idle there for hours in the cold had been irresponsible. How long had he been gone on that walk? Something about the memory of his father's gruff voice unsettled him. He shook it off. He had more pressing concerns. He eased the pup into the passenger seat. The dog stirred, blinking. Daniel rummaged behind the seat for a threadbare towel that smelled faintly of old dust and engine oil. Gently, he patted the pup as dry as he could, trying to be careful around any tender spots. The dog whimpered softly. Its eyes glistened in the dim overhead cab light, brimming with an emotion Daniel couldn't quite read: fear, relief, maybe a swirl of both. Taking one last look at the pup's condition, Daniel noticed something strange. A thin patch of fur on its shoulder. It looked like a scar or a brand. But the dog was so dirty and wet that Daniel couldn't make it out properly. Maybe it was a patch of missing fur from an old injury or a sign of a neglected collar. He tucked a mental note away to examine it later. Turning the key in the ignition, he coaxed the old engine to life. With a grumble and a shudder, the truck roared awake. Daniel pulled out onto the lonely road. The headlights cut through the darkness, bouncing as the tires navigated potholes. He angled toward town, heart still skipping beats every time the dog coughed or shifted on the seat beside him. There was an all-night veterinary hospital on the outskirts. He pressed harder on the gas, eyes flicking to the dog every few seconds. The pup had its muzzle pressed to the window now, small black nose leaving smudges on the glass. Just the fact it had enough curiosity to look outside made Daniel hopeful that this poor creature would recover. Yet in his gut, he felt an urgency he couldn't name. Something about rescuing this dog felt bigger than a spontaneous act of kindness. It felt like the start of something. He tried to push that thought away. He didn't want to dramatize the moment. But the question still burned. Who would let a dog drown? The clinic's fluorescent lights were harsh and sterile. Daniel's footsteps squeaked on the white tiles as he carried the dog inside. A tired-looking receptionist glanced up with a polite smile, quickly replaced by concern as she saw the soaked fur, the trembling limbs. "We need some help," Daniel said. I found him in the river." She hopped up, motioning for one of the vet techs to bring a gurney. But the dog was so small that Daniel carried it easily over to the exam table. The veterinarian, an older woman with silver hair pulled into a messy bun, arrived swiftly with a stethoscope. She murmured something about intake forms, but the look on Daniel's face must have told her to hold the questions for later. Within minutes, the dog was being examined under bright examination lights. Daniel hovered, arms crossed, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He never liked medical environments. Even for animals, the beeping machines, the smell of antiseptic, the sense of helplessness that got under his skin. The dog whimpered as the vet checked its heart rate, temperature, looked into its eyes, then parted the gums. "Breathing is a bit labored," she reported quietly, "but no immediate sign of water in the lungs. We'll get an X-ray to be sure. Looks like a near drowning with mild hypothermia." She paused. "Do you know anything about the dog's medical history?" Daniel shook his head. I'm sorry, I just found him. He was alone in the water." "All right," the vet said softly. "We'll do some blood work, see if he has any infections or injuries that aren't obvious. If you don't mind waiting, we'll keep him overnight. If he belongs to someone, maybe there's a microchip. We'll check for that too." Daniel felt relief flood him. "Thank you," he managed. I'll wait, whatever it takes." She nodded with a small smile, and a tech came to guide him to the waiting area. Daniel settled into a plastic chair, the overhead lights humming. A vending machine rattled in the corner. He stared at the vacant reception desk, shoulders hunched, every nerve ablaze from the day's events. Minutes blurred into an hour. The clock ticked past midnight. Occasionally, he heard the beep of equipment from behind the closed doors or the murmur of voices. Each time footsteps approached, his heart hammered, anticipating good or bad news. Finally, the vet emerged, gloves still on, face calm but serious. Daniel stood so abruptly that the plastic chair squeaked across the floor. "How is he?" he asked. She let out a careful breath. "Stable for now. Vital signs are improving, though he's definitely in shock and malnourished. No broken bones. The X-ray doesn't show fluid buildup in the lungs, which is good. We'll keep monitoring." We gave him some warm IV fluids and started an antibiotic prophylactically. "He's tough." Daniel felt relief warm him from the inside. "That's great news. Really, thank you." She dipped her head in acknowledgement. "There's one thing. We found something peculiar." She glanced at the folder in her hand. "There's a brand on his shoulder, like some sort of imprint or scar. And there's no microchip, so we can't identify an owner that way. But the brand looks deliberate. Someone might have been marking him." Daniel swallowed. His mind flashed back to that bald patch. "So you think he was abused?" "I wouldn't jump to conclusions yet. Sometimes dogs rescued from large-scale breeding operations or unscrupulous owners have brandings, but it could be from something else. The important thing is that it doesn't appear to be infected. We'll watch for signs of deeper trauma." His throat went dry, so many questions whirled. Is he going to be okay? "As of now, I think he'll recover physically, but time will tell if there's any trauma or fear response. He's a sweet dog under all that stress, and he keeps whining whenever he can't see you." Daniel's heart clenched. The dog was already attached to him. He rubbed the back of his neck, unsure how to respond. He'd never planned on adopting. His life was in shambles, lost job opportunities, a painful breakup, an estranged relationship with his only surviving family. And now there was this dog that seemed to want nobody else but him. "Do you want to see him?" the vet asked gently. Before Daniel could talk himself out of it, he nodded. She led him back to the recovery area, where the dog lay curled on a small blanket in a steel kennel. An IV line was taped to its front paw, and it glanced up at Daniel with exhausted eyes. The second it recognized him, its tail gave a feeble wag. Daniel felt an unexpected ache tighten his chest. "Hey there," he murmured, crouching. He slipped his fingers through the bars and the dog nudged them, letting out a soft whine. The connection was instantaneous, like a jolt of electricity passing between them. Something inside Daniel broke apart, a small flicker of warmth and responsibility. In a life that felt otherwise untethered, this dog clung to him as if he were the only anchor in a chaotic world. He stayed there, stroking the dog's cheek, ignoring the metallic smell of antiseptic, ignoring the exhaustion pounding in his head. He didn't want to leave, but the vet gently insisted they needed to keep the pup under observation. Daniel finally agreed, gave the dog one last pat, and left his contact information at the front desk, promising to return in the morning. The lonely drive home was a blur of headlights and swirling questions. Why had this dog been left in that river? And what was he supposed to do now? Morning dawned gray and sullen, with rain tapping the windows of Daniel's small apartment. He barely slept, haunted by images of thrashing water and the dog's panicked eyes. After a quick coffee that did nothing to energize him, he was back in the truck, heading to the clinic. The vet greeted him with a polite nod. "He did well overnight," she said. "A bit restless but stable. We did more scans. Looks like his paw might have an old fracture that healed incorrectly, possibly from a rough past. Other than that, it's mostly exhaustion and malnourishment." Relief flooded Daniel again, though a bitter swirl of anger tightened his jaw. Whoever had owned this dog clearly hadn't cared for him properly, and if they'd truly thrown him in the river, he banished the thought before it unleashed the full extent of his rage. "So, if no one comes looking for him," Daniel said slowly, "can I?" He felt oddly shy, as though someone might scold him for daring to consider it. The vet's face softened. "You can adopt him if you want. Usually we post found animals with the local shelter to see if an owner is searching. But if it's an abuse case, or if no one claims him, you could give him a home. He seems to trust you." Daniel exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "I'd like that." They told him it would be a few days before the dog was ready to leave. In that time, Daniel visited daily, forging a bond with the small survivor. He talked to the pup like a confidant. He even tried out names, but none seemed to fit just yet. Each day, the dog seemed stronger. Its eyes brightened. It would wag its tail when Daniel appeared, sometimes letting out a short bark of excitement. That brand on the shoulder haunted Daniel. Now that the dog was cleaner, the patch of missing fur formed a strange shape, like two curved lines intersecting. The vet took a photograph, but neither she nor Daniel recognized the symbol. It looked half like a loop, half like an odd rune. Whenever Daniel gently ran his fingers near it, the dog let out a low whine, clearly in pain or distress. Something had happened to this poor creature, something that left more than just a scar. 3 days later, the vet deemed the dog well enough to go home with instructions. A special diet, medication for the healing paw, routine checkups. She gave Daniel a few pamphlets on rehabilitating potentially traumatized animals. Daniel walked out of the clinic holding a leash, the dog trotting beside him, tail swishing anxiously. He loaded the pup into the truck with a cushioned blanket and started the drive back. The early morning sun cast dappled patterns across the road. He glanced over at the dog. It was looking out the window, ears perking as it took in the outside world. A little spark of hope flickered in Daniel. Maybe saving this dog wasn't just about rescuing an animal. Maybe it was rescuing himself, too. That first week passed in a mixture of chaos and heartwarming moments. The dog, shy at first, grew bolder every day. It would sniff around Daniel's cramped apartment, tail wagging when it found a new corner. It would watch him brew coffee, give a happy bark when Daniel placed a dish of food on the floor. Sometimes it followed him from room to room as though terrified of being abandoned again. Daniel had never cared for another being so completely. He found himself slipping out of bed at dawn to walk the dog, feeling the crisp morning air fill his lungs. He discovered that the mundane routines, picking out dog food, measuring medication, checking on that branded scar, somehow grounded him in the present moment, dragging him away from the swirling regrets that usually plagued him. The pup's presence at his feet while he answered job ads on his laptop made the task feel less suffocating. And at night, when the dog curled up next to him, Daniel felt a quiet peace that had eluded him for years. But not all was perfect. Strange things started to happen. One night, Daniel was jolted awake by a heart-stopping bark. The dog was standing at the window, hackles raised, growling at the darkness beyond the glass. Daniel shot up, heart pounding, fumbling for the lights. Outside, only this glow illuminated the empty pavement. Rain was falling softly. Nothing moved. Yet the dog kept up a low growl, ears flat, as though it sensed something Daniel couldn't see. He tried comforting it, flicking on the porch light. Nothing out there, just water dripping off the eaves. Eventually, the dog calmed, but it stood guard at Daniel's feet for the rest of the night, eyes never leaving the window. Another time, Daniel was out walking the pup on a narrow trail behind his apartment complex. The dog suddenly froze, staring into a grove of trees, whining. Its entire body trembled. Daniel knelt, trying to coax it forward. No luck. The dog dug in its paws. There was a sense of looming dread in the air, though Daniel could see nothing out of the ordinary, just the hush of wind in the trees, the rustle of leaves. He finally picked the pup up in his arms, carrying it home. Throughout the walk back, the dog craned its neck, eyes locked on the forest as though expecting something to leap out. Over the following days, the dog's initial caution began to morph into skittish paranoia. It startled at small noises, pawed nervously at that mysterious brand on its shoulder whenever it was anxious, sometimes growling at the empty air. Daniel worried, unsure how to help. The vet suggested socializing, patience, maybe consulting a trainer. Yet Daniel sensed something deeper, like the dog was anticipating an unseen threat. He began researching. Late into the nights, he searched online for dog brand symbols or scars that looked similar. He found countless pictures of ranch dogs, hunting dogs, even livestock branding. None matched the strange loop-like rune on the pup's shoulder. Daniel posted on local lost and found pet groups describing the dog and the brand. Nothing. No one claimed him. The anonymity of the dog's past gnawed at him, especially when the pup's eyes would fill with a haunted look. What had it gone through? Why had it been in the river? If someone had thrown it there, were they still nearby? Despite the unease, Daniel formed an intense bond with the pup. He found himself confiding in it, his regrets about leaving college midway through, the heartbreak from a relationship that crumbled under the weight of his insecurities, the father who rarely expressed pride in him. In those quiet moments, the dog would rest its chin on Daniel's knee, tail giving gentle wags, as if to say, "I'm here." It was a comfort he never realized he needed. Then came the day that changed everything. It started as a normal afternoon. Daniel had just returned from the store, a new bag of dog treats in hand when the pup bounded to greet him, tail thumping the floor. Daniel laughed, patting its head. "Hope you're hungry," he teased. "I found your favorite." Before he could unpack the groceries, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He almost ignored it, but a strange prickle at the back of his neck compelled him to answer. "Hello." A man's voice, low and urgent, said, "Are you the one who posted about a dog with a brand on a local forum?" Daniel's pulse skittered. "Yes, I was looking for any information or an owner." The man's inhale crackled through the phone line. "I'm not the owner," he said quietly, "but I think I know what that brand might mean." Daniel's heart hammered. "You do. Please tell me anything you know." The dog was. "Not on the phone," the man cut in. "We need to meet. This is bigger than you think. There's a diner out by Old Highway 12 near the abandoned textile mill. Meet me there at 6 p.m. tomorrow." Daniel felt a swirl of doubt, fear, and curiosity. "Who are you?" A pause. "I can't talk about it now. Too dangerous." The line clicked dead. For a long moment Daniel stood there, the phone buzzing in his hand, groceries forgotten at his feet. The dog gazed up at him as though sensing his agitation. Daniel's heart raced. Had he just stumbled into something sinister? The rational side of him wanted to ignore the call. This was too bizarre, too risky. Yet an undeniable pull forced him to consider going. What if this was the key to understanding the dog's past? Could he live with himself if he turned away from answers? He thought about the dog's terrified eyes that first night, the brand seared onto its skin. If there was even a chance to learn the truth, he had to take it. The next evening, Daniel pulled up to the diner on Old Highway 12. The building crouched by the deserted road like a relic from another era, flickering neon sign half burned out, windows dusty. A single car, a nondescript sedan, was parked out front. Daniel's stomach flipped. He'd considered bringing the dog but worried it might be too dangerous. Instead, he'd left it at home with fresh water and an anxious heart. He half hoped the stranger wouldn't show, and he could return to the pup with no new worries. The bell above the diner door jingled as he stepped in. A lone waitress glanced up, her expression bored. The interior was dimly lit by old fluorescent tubes, casting a sickly green glow. A man sat in a back booth, face partially hidden beneath a baseball cap. He raised a hand in greeting. Daniel swallowed hard and approached. The man nodded for Daniel to sit. He looked rough around the edges, tattoos peeking from the sleeves of his jacket, stubble on his jaw. His eyes flicked around the diner as if checking for eavesdroppers. He said at last. Daniel, he replied, feeling tension coil in his shoulders. A waitress ambled over, took their orders, just waved her off with a curt, "Coffee." Daniel asked for the same. Silence hung until she moved away, then leaned in. "I saw your post about a dog with a brand on its shoulder. A weird, looping symbol." Daniel nodded, heart pounding. "Yes, that's right. Studied him for a moment. You have any idea what you've gotten yourself into?" "No," Daniel admitted. "All I know is I found this dog drowning in the river and nobody has claimed him. He's traumatized. And that brand." His jaw tightened. "That brand's from a ring of sick people who do unsanctioned animal experimentation. Some of it's for black market breeding, illegal fighting. But I've also heard rumors of something even worse. Like they were messing around with substances or chemicals or some occult nonsense. I don't know the full scope, but it's not good. Their dogs end up changed. Some die, some vanish. That brand is a marker, a sign that the dog belongs to them, that it's been tested on. If your dog escapes and you have it, you're in danger." Daniel's stomach lurched. The waitress clinked down 2 mugs of coffee and left. He stared at in disbelief. That sounds insane. Are you sure?" Let out a hard breath. "I used to run with the wrong crowd, do security for questionable outfits. That's how I learned about this group. I managed to get out and I've been trying to expose them since. But they're slippery, well-connected. Every time I get close, I find roadblocks or people getting threatened." Daniel swallowed. The dog's skittish behavior made a disturbing kind of sense now. "So, you think they tried to dispose of him in the river?" "Maybe," said grimly. "If the dog was defective or if they were done with their sick tests. It's also possible the dog ran away and they tried to chase him off a bank. Or maybe they tried to drown him outright. Either way, they'll want him back if there's something special about him. Evidence, maybe. They might not even know he's alive, but if they find out." The words pressed on Daniel's chest like a vice. He thought of the dog's trembling body, the brand. How do I protect him? Glanced around warily. Lay low, don't post pictures of him anymore. Don't go around asking questions. If these people suspect you have one of their test dogs, they might come after you. I asked around, but I don't know where their main operation is right now. They move frequently. If I find it, I can get the authorities involved. But for now, keep that dog hidden." Daniel felt cold sweat on his neck. A sense of unreality pressed in. This was the last thing he'd expected. He'd imagined a cruel owner or a dog-fighting ring, but not some clandestine group with twisted experiments. "If you find more info, call me," he said hoarsely. Nodded, scribbled a number on a napkin. "I will, just be careful. This brand, the dog, there's a reason they marked him. Could be he's valuable. I've seen them brand animals that exhibit unusual abilities." His eyes flickered, reflecting a deep, haunted fear. Daniel's mouth went dry. "Abilities like what?" Shrugged. "I don't know the details. But some say the animals they experiment on become hyper-intuitive, or their behavior changes in unpredictable ways. Could be purely rumor. But watch for anything unusual with your dog. If something seems off, call me." Daniel's skin tingled as he recalled the dog growling at shadows, staring at empty spaces. It's just trauma, he told himself. But doubt gnawed. He thanked, paid for the coffee, and left, the diner bell echoing behind him like a funeral toll. Outside, the sky was overcast, a dusty gloom settling over the deserted highway. Daniel hurried to his truck, glancing over his shoulder more than once, heart hammering. He half expected to see someone lurking, watching. Instead, only the wind stirred the weeds by the roadside. The drive home felt surreal, words looping in his mind. By the time he reached his apartment, thunderheads were rolling in, and a spattering of rain flecked the windshield. He hurried inside, heart pounding. The dog rushed to greet him, tail wagging in that earnest, relieved way that always melted Daniel's worries. Except now, his worries had new shape and teeth. He crouched down, ruffled the pup's ears, earning a happy bark. For a moment, the dog's simple, pure joy let Daniel breathe again. "You okay, buddy?" Daniel asked softly. The dog licked his hand. Daniel's mind spun with images of lab experiments, cages, syringes, cruelty that made his stomach churn. Perhaps the dog sensed Daniel's fear, because it let out a quiet whine and pressed closer to his leg, as though offering comfort in return. Daniel found himself wrapping the dog in his arms, pressing his cheek to the pup's soft fur. "I won't let them take you," he promised fiercely. "I don't care who they are." Lightning flashed through the window, illuminating the apartment in a stark white glare. The dog pulled back, ears flattening. A low growl rumbled in its throat, directed at the window. That ominous feeling returned, as if the dog sensed a presence outside. Daniel swallowed hard. He went to the window and peered through the blinds. Nothing in the parking lot except rain-slicked cars. No movement in the shadows. But the dog kept up its quiet growl, a warning to the world beyond the glass. In the days that followed, Daniel lived on edge. He was jumpy, scanning the street every time he took the dog for a walk, flinching whenever a stranger glanced too long at them. The pup seemed equally on high alert, tail stiff when they passed alleys or thick shrubbery. At night, the dog would stare out the window, occasionally letting out that low warning growl. Daniel tried to project calm, praising the dog for good behavior, offering gentle reassurance whenever it seemed frightened. He limited their walks to less busy routes, changed his routine daily. He took advice and posted no updates about the dog. Friends asked him how he was doing, but he offered only vague replies. A friend from college, hearing about the rescue dog, asked for pictures. Daniel politely declined. A prickle of paranoia told him not to trust anyone outside his small circle of absolute confidence. Meanwhile, sent occasional texts. No real updates, just cautions to stay alert. The police couldn't act without concrete evidence, and leads on the group's hideouts kept turning up empty. Daniel's anxiety blossomed. Every time the phone rang unexpectedly, his stomach twisted. He made sure to keep the dog's new ID collar hidden beneath the fur, and he got a small crate for travel, just in case they had to leave quickly. In the midst of this tension, Daniel noticed something strange about the dog. He was trying to teach it simple commands: sit, stay, come. The pup was a quick learner. Within a couple of tries, it obeyed almost perfectly. Even complicated tricks like weaving through Daniel's legs or rolling over seemed to come unnaturally fast. At times, it felt like the dog was reading his intent before he even gave the signal. He'd start to say sit, and the dog would already be lowering its haunches, as though tuned in to Daniel's mind. It wasn't just commands. The pup seemed hyper-aware of Daniel's emotions, too. If Daniel had a moment of panic, thinking about job rejections or swirling nightmares about cruel experiments, the dog would sidle up, resting its chin on his thigh. It sometimes stared at him with an unnerving intensity. Daniel found it comforting and also unsettling. He tried to brush it off as the bond between man and dog, but a tiny whisper in his mind asked, "Is this some leftover effect of whatever horrors those people inflicted on him?" One afternoon, Daniel tested a hypothesis. He laid out 3 dog treats in a row, only one of which had any scent. He walked to another room. Then he pictured in his mind, just pictured, the dog picking the treat on the far left. He stepped back in. The dog scanned the 3 treats, then went straight to the left one, ignoring the others. Daniel's skin prickled. Maybe it was a coincidence, or maybe not. 3 more tries produced the same result. He called the vet to ask if the dog might have an unusually keen sense of smell or intelligence. She said it was possible the pup was just very perceptive, but recommended seeing a professional trainer if Daniel was concerned. He hesitated, not wanting to draw attention. Instead, he kept these observations to himself, unsure what they meant. When he tried to sleep that night, the dog curled at his side. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Daniel stared at the cracked ceiling, thoughts looping. What if was right, and there was a group out there searching for this dog, wanting to harness some bizarre ability? The notion felt like a thriller movie plot, but he couldn't deny the dog was special. It had survived a near drowning, overcame trauma, and seemed to possess an uncanny awareness. If unscrupulous people wanted it back, how far would they go? Lightning flared. The dog lifted its head, ears perked. Another growl rumbled in its chest. Daniel's phone buzzed on the nightstand, making him jump. He snatched it, seeing his name on the screen. Confusion flitted across his face, rarely called. Heart pounding, Daniel answered. His voice was hushed, urgent. "They found me," he said, breath rattling the speaker. Daniel sat bolt upright. "What, who?" "The people who want that dog," hissed. "They must traced my phone or recognized me somewhere. They cornered me in an alley. I barely escaped. I'm heading out of town tonight, but I had to warn you, you need to get out too. They know the dog's alive." Daniel's thoughts roared. What should I do? A car horn blared in the background on its end. "Pack up and vanish for a while. Go someplace remote. I'm sorry, Daniel, but it's the only way. If they're onto me, they'll be onto you next." Daniel's stomach clenched. "All right." The line crackled. "Take care." "You too," said, voice rough. The call ended. Daniel set the phone down, hands trembling. The dog was staring at him, the brand on its shoulder visible under the moonlight streaming through the window. The pup looked tense, as if sensing the conversation's importance. Daniel's mind raced. Could he even afford to drop everything and run? He was barely scraping by on freelance gigs. He had no real anchor in this city, but leaving on a whim felt insane. Then he glanced at the dog, remembering how close it had come to drowning. If these people would do that once, they might do worse. Daniel rose, grabbed a duffel bag, and started stuffing clothes into it, adrenaline fueling him. The dog watched quietly, ears twitching. He'd figure out the details later, sleep in his truck if he had to. The priority was safety. Soon he had the essentials: clothes, dog supplies, important documents. He coaxed the dog into its crate, loaded the truck in the dead of night. Rain whispered across the parking lot. Daniel hesitated only once, scanning the shadows for any sign of watchers. Seeing none, he climbed into the driver's seat and fired up the engine. With a shaky breath, he pulled out of the lot. No plan, no real destination, only the urge to vanish before they came knocking. The city lights faded behind him. He merged onto the highway, headlights cutting through the drizzle. The dog whined softly in the passenger seat. "It's okay," Daniel said, though a tremor in his voice betrayed his own fear. "We're going to be okay." He kept driving, until the city was just a faint glow in the mirror. Dawn found him on a winding back road, far from any major town, exhaustion dragging on his eyelids. He pulled into a deserted rest stop, a mere patch of asphalt near a line of trees. He killed the engine, letting out a shaky exhale. The dog pawed at the crate door, wanting out. Daniel opened it, and the pup hopped onto the seat beside him, pressing its muzzle against his shoulder. "It's just us, buddy," Daniel whispered. Tears threatened to sting his eyes, but he blinked them away. He wasn't a crier. Life had taught him to keep it together, yet the dog's gentle warmth brought a lump to his throat. "I'm sorry I can't give you a normal life." The dog licked his cheek as though to say it's enough. Somehow Daniel drifted off in the driver's seat, the dog curled at his side. Rain pattered the roof, lulling them both into a fitful slumber. But in his dreams, Daniel saw shadows lunging from the darkness, rough hands brandishing syringes, a swirling brand that glowed red-hot. He jerked awake more than once, heart hammering, only to find the dog peering at him in concern. By sunrise, a plan formed in Daniel's mind. His paternal grandparents had once owned a rundown cabin near Lake Williston, a couple hours from where he sat. He hadn't visited in years. His father had let the place fall into disrepair. But if it still stood, it'd be remote, seldom visited. He could hide there until got in touch, maybe gather evidence or figure out a more permanent solution. The dog's tail thumped as if in agreement when Daniel voiced his plan out loud. With renewed determination, he turned the key in the ignition and steered the truck north. The roads were nearly empty, winding through farmland and scraggly forests. Time blurred as the miles melted away. Anxiety nagged at him each time he spotted another car or a vacant stretch of road. Was he being followed? He saw no sign of pursuit, yet a constant tension coiled in his gut. Finally, the turnoff for Lake Williston appeared, a weed-choked gravel path that twisted into dense pines. The truck jostled over ruts and potholes, branches scratching the sides like skeletal fingers. After nearly half an hour, the path ended in a small clearing. There stood the cabin, a sagging structure with peeling paint, shuttered windows, a porch step half collapsed. Daniel cut the engine, absorbing the hush of the forest around them. The dog stuck its nose out the open window, sniffing the crisp air. For the first time in days, Daniel felt a small sense of relief. Seclusion might be their best ally. He climbed out, letting the dog jump to the ground. Together they approached the cabin. The front door was locked, but a key was hidden under a loose plank on the porch, a relic from simpler times. He tested it in the rusted doorknob, and with a protesting squeak, the door swung open. Dust motes drifted in the musty air. The interior was cramped, a single large room with a kitchenette, a worn couch, and a fireplace. A side door led to a tiny bedroom. Spider webs adorned the corners, and the furniture smelled of mildew. But it was a shelter. Daniel sneezed, stirring the dust from the rotted floorboards. "Home sweet home," he muttered to the dog. The pup sniffed around, no doubt inhaling 1,000 new scents. Daniel opened the windows to let in fresh air. Then he dragged an old broom from the closet and started sweeping decades of grime off the floor. If they were staying here, it at least needed to be livable. Once the worst of the dirt was cleared, he unloaded the truck. Groceries, dog supplies, bedding. He found some old pots and pans in a cupboard, rusted but usable. He tested the plumbing, still functional, though the water ran brown for a minute. There was electricity, amazingly, though the overhead bulb in the main room flickered ominously. He'd have to be careful about the wiring. As evening fell, the dog sprawled on a blanket near the fireplace, tail thumping contentedly when Daniel set down a bowl of fresh water. Exhausted, Daniel sank into the creaking couch. The last time he'd been here was as a child, one of the rare father-son fishing trips that ended in an argument. He recalled the day they left in a huff, his father cursing the leaky roof. That memory made him feel hollow. Now the roof was still leaky, but at least it was overhead. Daniel forced a smile, petting the dog's head. "We'll stay here a while," he murmured, "just until things cool down." The dog nudged his hand, eyes bright in the fading light. Daniel wondered if the pup missed having space to run around or other dogs to play with.